Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Live. So 2 weeks ago, I went over the concept of continuum-based thinking, and I got some good feedback on that, but I was certain that it was not specific enough and that I was going to need to expand on it a bit. So what I'd like to do for the next couple of weeks is be a bit more specific in the idea of this continuum-based thinking and break down different topics. So the first topic that I'm going to touch on, and I have touched on this in other podcasts before, but I'll go into a little bit more detail here, is the movement continuum. And this is just the way that I look at movement as a physical therapist and as a personal trainer. And it's basically my system of keeping everything together from a movement perspective, whether I'm working with somebody with injury or whether I'm trying to help somebody improve their fitness and be able to connect the dots or bridge the gap, which is so commonly said in the idea of rehab and fitness. So we'll try to get a general gist of what a movement continuum is, but just keep in mind this overall topic of continuum-based thinking is ultimately that we're not defining anything as set in stone, as specific entities, but everything is sort of in flow and always can be made easier, it can be made harder. So we have to be able to use certain language to teach something, but the word continuum by nature means that nothing is static. And even when I talk about things like positions, which seem like they have a very static definition, even that is in flux and it's very much dependent on one's intent. So if we look at the broad strokes or overall overview of the movement continuum, we're looking at several things that we have to ask and identify. One, we have to understand the various positions of a movement. We can call them postures. I also like to refer to them as positions of intent, as opposed to just positions as if there is a one right position that we have to hit. Most of the time, this is just standards that we're going for, and they could vary person to person. So there isn't inherent positions, but for the person in the moment that you see them, the position of intent is what is the more static posture. If we slowed everything down and stopped everything from moving, that we would be able to identify as saying, okay, this is where we want to be. This is as close as we want to get. What are some of the standards of those positions? And that becomes sort of a snapshot of the overall movement that we could slow down and we can work on and make something that might feel more complex a little bit simpler. And then once we understand the more snapshot portions of the movement, do we understand the various possibilities of the transitions from one position to the next? Once we understand that those are the two ingredients that make up movement, then we can look at different markers of control that we would be always keeping an eye on to assess safety, readiness. Readiness is likely a better way to think about this. But safety and readiness a lot of times go hand in hand, with safety being maybe a little bit more in the individual's subjective of what they feel ready for. And then we can look at this from a coach's eye, what you feel like your client is ready for. But the two tend to go together. And that's ultimately what we're looking at when we're trying to understand these markers of control, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And then we want to look at how do we challenge position? How do we challenge transition? So broadly, we're looking at progressively decreasing assistance. So if we were standing on two legs and we moved to one leg, we may have to originally hold on to something. So if we're challenging our balance, we have to hold on. We progressively remove some of that support from our hand or whatever we're holding on to. And there's various ways that we can do that. The other broad principle is that we're going to progressively manipulate pillars of support. So that's just going from two legs to one leg, going from quadruped, four limbs, two hands, two knees, to opposite arm and leg, which would be two limbs. So we're progressively manipulating pillars of support. That could be as gradual as I have a whole hand on the ground giving me support, and I remove one finger, then I remove another finger, and then I remove another finger. We can be as gradual as we need to be. This is a game of inches. It could also be a game of millimeters. It could be as small as it needs to be. And then we can also progressively manipulate leverage. Think of it from a perspective, if we are on our backs and we're grabbing onto our knees with our hands, and we lift our head up off the ground, that might give our abdominals a little bit of challenge, or our position a little bit of challenge to keep our back on the ground, but generally that'd be pretty easy. But then as we start to move our knees farther away from our head and our hands more overhead and our legs get straighter, the act of trying to keep the back flat on the ground in that position, getting closer to what would be a hollow body type of movement, that gets harder and harder on our center because we're changing the leverage, we're manipulating leverage in those moments. So there's many ways that we can do that with any position in the body, but generally those are the three things that are always at play, and those three broad principles aren't in a continuum as well. So they could be turned up, turned down. That volume knob idea as gradually as we need to make sure that we feel ready for whatever we're doing that day. And then from a transitional control perspective, we're looking at progressively manipulating the eccentric and concentric component of a movement. So eccentric would be the slow lowering of a movement. So if we're standing and we're lowering ourselves slowly into a seat, that's the eccentric portion. Standing up from the seat would be the concentric portion of the movement. So we can manipulate that at different tempos. We can go faster, we can go slower. We're also messing around with different energy conservation and energy systems in the body. So for example, if we move very fast for a short amount of time, we're going to be promoting more of a creatine phosphagen system, use of our energy systems. If we go for a longer period of time, we're going to be using more oxygen. So we'll get into aerobic oxidative systems for energy use within the body. And then there's even a continuum within that of how we do it. Oftentimes it's not one or the other, it's a combination of things working together, but we have general ways of looking at intensity, speed, and duration all together. And that's something that we're manipulating as we manipulate the movement from one position to another. Ultimately, the goal of a movement continuum is to identify what positions or transitions can and cannot be controlled, so we can identify where within a movement an individual is safe or ready to train or be treated. If we're a therapist or we're working in a healthcare field and we're actually trying to treat some type of injury or pain, it just all fits into this movement continuum. To dive a little bit deeper into positions and transitions, and think of this movement continuum in one equation: movement equals position plus transition. And then we just can deconstruct the position and transition into all of these markers of control that we're looking for. So again, positions are more of the static portions, but again, static here, we're using that loosely because even that is in flux, or it's brief stops along the way in a more dynamic movement. And again, there is nothing that is right or wrong about positions, but if we're teaching something, we may have in our head some type of standard that we're looking for, and that standard may be very person specific. So the standing posture we might be looking for in one individual can be very different than it is for another. And I think that's really important, that we don't get too caught up in that there's a right way, but that there is just an intention for that person at that moment. We could take into account things like an optimal length tension relationship, which is generally a mid-range of a joint position where the muscle creates the most force. Basically, if we are doing a bicep curl and we hold dumbbells in the middle of our arm bend, we're going to feel stronger there than if we have the arms closer to fully extended versus if we have the arms fully flexed. So in the mid-range of a motion, so this is not too much towards extension, not too much towards flexion, or, we can think about the other planes of motion, but we're sort of somewhere in the middle. Usually our muscles have the most potential to produce better force there. That doesn't make it right, but that's a lot of times how postures are defined, or standards of postures are defined. They're based on this optimal length tension relationship. So it's just good to know where these things are coming from. I'm not arguing whether it's correct or not. There's also the idea of an optimal respiratory posture, where we have the middle of the diaphragm balanced over the middle of the pelvic diaphragm. So the respiratory diaphragm being at the bottom of the rib cage above the internal organs. And then if that's balanced over the pelvic diaphragm, which is basically the pelvic floor, which will be underneath the internal organs, there is a more optimal pressure cascade that can be created through the breath. Yeah, that's another reason that we may have certain standards of posture where we have, say, the head stacked over the rib cage over the pelvis, because it gives us a better starting point to optimize pressure. You can think about positions of inhalation versus positions of exhalation. So generally when we inhale, we're taking volume into our body and we're going to expand. And there's positions that are of expansion. So in the diaphragm, when we breathe in, that's inhalation, we actually expand because the diaphragm drops down, makes our rib cage wider, and then there is a cascade of pressure that should make other things expand. So some of the joint motions that we would think about that would be expansion is things towards external rotation, things towards flexion, things towards abduction. It's moving away from the midline of the body. And then exhalation would be more compression towards the center of the body. So extension, adduction, internal rotation type movements. All right, so these are just different ways that we can look at posture and give our posture and our position an intention, but all of these things are dynamic in that we're not necessarily looking at them all the same way at the same time. But in our heads, as clinicians, or even if we're working with our own body, we will identify an intention of a position, a static position that we want to get closer to. And that's going to be an important part of what we define as technique, or what we would be able to look at as an assessment of what we're ready for. Because if we can't hit these intentions, then maybe we have to make something easier. All right, so the idea of the static posture ultimately, or the idea of a positional assessment, is that it does slow things down for us many times. So you can think about many movements, especially athletic movements, or even something like walking. If we don't slow it down, it may be very hard to know where we're compensating. So you can look at the position aspect of the movement continuum is that it exposes compensation. So it makes us slow it down so we can see things that we're just unable to do. Our examples would be the bottom of a squat, top of a push-up, would be hanging on a bar prior to a pull-up, but just in a more functional sense too. You could break down walking into, okay, I'm standing on one leg and my heel's initially striking the ground. We can define different positions that we want to see how people do. If we put them there, how do they balance there? What do their bodies want to do naturally? Moving on to transition, we have the idea of a dynamic change from one position to another. So again, we have these snapshots. All right, and now the transition is the animation. We're moving from one position to the other. And this takes into account things like power, strength, endurance, speed. How many times do we want to transition back and forth between one position to the next? How many reps do we want to do? How fast do we want that rep to be? How much tension do we want that rep to have? All those things can play a part in the transitional continuum that we look at. An important concept here is dissociation, is this idea of separating action from where we want to move from where we want to be relatively still from. And that, together that creates this idea of a compensation. If we are trying to move a shoulder, but our shoulder blade and our spine and our body all moves together, we think we're moving our shoulder, we see our hand move, but we don't actually realize we're not moving our shoulder. Over time, that becomes very common. We stop moving from certain joints in the body, and it creates different problems with atrophy, and creates different problems with tissue change, just because we're not getting any circulation and movement to an area, and we don't get movement to an area, don't get basically nutrition to that area. So it is important to know where we're moving from, where we're not moving from, and how to actually dissociate motion a bit better. All right, so that's going to be an important part of this transitional assessment. Again, I talked about concentric, eccentric transitions. All right, do we want to just focus on standing up and not worry about how we sit down? Or do we want to focus more on how controlled we are in lowering, how controlled we are with landing? All that goes into a transitional continuum. And then again, we're going to assess these markers of control. So the markers of control that we'll look at is pain, breath control, postural control, impact control. So these four things are the broad categorizations of assessment when we're looking at what we're ready for and what's safe. All right, so with pain, I'm not going to be so concerned about what's wrong, but I want to be concerned about the onset of pain at different parts of a movement or even after a movement. So the three major things I'm looking for in this movement continuum in regards to pain are positional pain. Do you have pain while you're static in a position, while you're just standing still or where you're just sitting still? Is there a certain posture of stillness, basically, that brings your symptoms on? And what is that posture? Let's work on that posture. Can we change it? Can we make adjustments to it that actually adjust your pain? Transitionally, do you have pain when you're moving from one position to the next? So very commonly you'll see, I'm fine when I sit. As soon as I go to stand up, that hurts. Or I'm fine when I'm lying in bed. I go to roll in bed. That's when I get pain. That's just a different categorization. You usually treat that a little differently. Ultimately, the pain and the change of pain becomes the indicator of what to do about it, not some type of idea of an x-ray or idea of a diagnosis. It becomes, okay, here is this categorization of what is provoking pain. Let's work with the position, let's work with the transition and see if we can change it. And usually you can do that in the moment, and then that gives us more awareness of what to do about it. And we also get, what's really, really important around pain is, if we know what provokes it, we also know what doesn't provoke it. And we can give people more confidence that they could do more than they think in the face of pain. And that's probably 80% of the rehab, where 20% is working around the area of pain. 80% is making sure that people know what they can do safely so they can keep themselves active. All right, and then I like to refer to this as immune pain, but or you could just think of it as pain after a movement. And the reason I've just come to the conclusion in my own clinical practice that the immune system is involved in that common experience where you get pain after activity. And, I like to connect the dots between pain that feels like it's orthopedic in nature, or it's very specific to a joint in nature, but it's after activity. You don't really have this sensation or this warning sign while you're moving, but afterwards, things are a little bit worse. And you could think of this as a stress to the body. But I like to connect the dots to what is commonly referred to as delayed onset muscle soreness, which I think is a misnomer, because it is, to label it as muscle soreness is not appreciating how many systems are involved in the fact that it is likely just an inflammatory response. And any inflammatory response is connected to the immune system responding to a threat. All right. And it's not necessarily a threat that you perceive in the moment, but that it is something you did that was a little bit more volume than you're used to, something that you did that is new to your body. If you've taken some time off and you have a new injury, now your whole nervous system, your whole immune system has a different response to threat than it did before that injury. And all of this needs to be reconditioned, but it needs to be conditioned gradually. And there has to be a negotiation, a coordination between any practitioner that is trying to get somebody to do something, to do more movement, and the person themselves and what they find safe, right? So any pain is going to automatically light up the nervous system, light up the immune system in a way that says this is not safe. But we have to then have a discussion about, okay, is it the activity that you did, the actual movement that you did, that is the problem? Or is it that we did a little bit more than the body was used to, or that the body had recently done, or that we're just getting back into activity? And can we somehow create a similar movement with either a little less volume or make it a little bit easier? We turn down the volume within the movement continuum. We make the position a little bit easier. We make the transition a little bit slower. We do something that feels safer, but we keep it in the continuum of that movement that we're trying to train, so that we don't link the movement as unsafe as a whole, and we don't eliminate it from our menu of options for life. And this, I think, is a really important thing, where we have to have that conversation, and we have to have this negotiation of saying, okay, things got a little bit worse. We didn't anticipate that, but here's what we did. Can we make the thing that you did either the same, and see, do you get the same response the next time? Because now your body is going to recognize it again as not as new of a thing, not as threatening of a thing, because it's been done before. It's been done more recently. Or do we just have to turn it down a little bit? And then how does your body respond to that the next day? So it is a little tricky to work with this immune type of pain, this pain that's after movement. But if we are able to describe it as something that the body's already used to, maybe this kind of delayed onset muscle soreness. And when we really get delayed onset muscle soreness, for those who've really experienced it, it's it's hard to say that it's just in the muscles. You will feel it a lot of places. Feel it in our muscles, we feel it in our joints, but generally I notice it as a full body type of fatigue and pain, but there's not much threat to it because you can link it to what you did and you've been there before. You know it'll kind of work its way out. You just view it as part of the process. When it touches something that's similar to an injury that has been a bigger threat, that laid you up for a longer period of time, that affected your function for a longer period of time, well, now that's a totally different experience. Even though the pain, the actual felt experience of it may be quite similar, the thoughts around it, the story around it becomes very different because it gets linked to something that limited function as opposed to linked to something that is improving conditioning or improving fitness. But if we look at it as it's a response to something new, it's a response to a threat, regardless of where you feel it, and if it's part of that full inflammatory immune response, it actually is quite a similar process. So we have to think about it in a similar way. If we do something from an exercise standpoint that creates this full body feeling of delayed onset muscle soreness, the answer is not to do the exact same thing or do more that day. We let our body recover a little bit from that. We're just not as threatened by it. We're familiar with it, and the body does recover. And then we don't give up on what brought us there. We actually do that again, and now it takes more to bring that same type of feeling on. And there's a lot of different variables. I'm making it sound very simple and linear, but it's not linear. There's always so many variables at play of why your body may feel more soreness the morning after than it did on another day doing things that you felt were similar. But we do have to let it play out a little bit, and to keep it as systematic as possible, to keep it in this continuum as much as possible, we can look at, okay, what are the activities that you felt were new to the body, were threatening to the body, and how can we make that just a little bit easier, but still keep you in the game? And I think that's one of the most important conversations to have around pain. If we look at breath control, we can, again, look at a breathing manner or some type of breathing technique that is intended depending on the position that one is in and the goal and the intensity of the activity. So for instance, positionally, if we're trying to just relax and hold a position longer, we may ask somebody to do a 4-7-8 breath where we inhale for 4 seconds, we retain the inhale, hold our breath after the inhale for 7 seconds, and then exhale for 8 seconds. And we see if someone can do that. We see how far off they are. If the intention is to get that 4-7-8 breath and they can't get it, and we want them to be able to get it, we have to make the action a little bit easier. If they can't do that in any position, then we have to actually make the ask a little easier. So instead of 4-7-8, we make it a 2-4-6 or something like that. But we have some type of assessment that we're looking for, and then we're seeing can someone match that. And there's a variety of different ways we can look at assessing a breathing technique while someone's in a static position. And then transitionally, it might be a little bit different. So we might ask somebody, can you inhale on the way down during a squat and then exhale on the way up? Can someone match that intention? And that doesn't mean, again, you have to do that every time you squat. It would just be something you're asking someone to do, and can they do what you're asking them to do? And if they can't, then maybe the action is too hard. So in this movement continuum, we may want to use the breath as a way to enhance our movement, and we'll often want to do that. So first thing is we got to just bring mindfulness. How are you breathing? How is one breathing positionally while they're static, or transitionally while they're moving from one position to the next? And then we can give them a specific goal or a specific intention within that, and then see if they can match it. If they can't match it, then again, we just turn the volume down until they can, and then we can move challenge forward with the breath. And oftentimes the way that we move challenge forward is we're able to hold each phase of the breath a little bit longer with control. We're also maybe able to hold our breath longer and create more force and more intra-abdominal pressure, more pressure in general, where we want to create that pressure in the body, which can give us more strength. Or we'll be able to move our limbs at a high rate and be working at a high intensity, but not be over breathing, not be wasting our respiration, basically. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at trying to control the breath. But if what we're asking someone to do with the breath is not able to be done, then we actually have to look at, okay, they might not be ready for that movement in that moment. Then we can look at postural control. And again, postural control is not an idea of the posture being a correct posture and incorrect posture, but just is someone able to get into the intended position? And that would be loosely defined as mobility. I want someone to get to a squat where their butt touches a 12-inch box. Can they get there? Yes or no? If they can't, all right, they don't have the mobility to do that. If they can, they at least have the mobility to do that. Yeah, they might be compensating in different ways. And then we can be more specific with what we're defining as the intended position. And then we can look at it from the other side of things. Can they sustain a position as we increase the challenge? So if someone's on hands and knees in a quadruped position, can they hang out there? Can you lift one hand and still hold your balance there? If we put a block on someone's back or a glass of water on someone's back, will they spill that water when we go from 4 pillars of support to 3 to 2, etc.? So I mentioned how you challenge position. As you challenge position, can you keep the intention of the initial position that you were looking for? That we can loosely call stability. All right, we already talked about dissociation, but that's going to be the major thing we look at when we're talking about transitional control. Can you separate motion from certain body regions that you want to be stable from those you want to be mobile? And then impact control, I find, is actually a really, really practical way to demonstrate control to somebody. If you're doing the challenging pillars of support positionally, so quadruped, I'm able to lift one hand, but my hand has to slam back down to the ground because I don't feel like I'm in control of that transition or that change from 4 pillars of support to 3 or to 2. Well, that shows me I don't have good impact control either in bringing those limbs back down to the ground. So statically, that's how we can assess something like that. If I'm standing on 2 legs and I ask someone to stand on 1 leg and they pick a foot up for a second, but then they have to quickly slam that foot back down to the ground because they don't feel stable with that adjustment of pillars of support, that's a sign of loss of impact control there. Transitionally, it's a little bit more obvious, but there's different ways to look at it. So a good example with walking is, are you slamming your feet into the ground or can you land lighter? Can you land lighter when you jump, when you run? So just the idea of lighter landings, softer landings. If I'm sitting in a chair, am I slamming down into the chair or can I sit down with control? If I'm asked to sit down with control, can I sit down softly? Can I tap and then change positions if that's the intention? You can think plyometrically. If I'm trying to jump off of a box and then I want to hit the ground and jump right back onto that box, how quickly can I get off the ground? How little time can I spend on the ground before I change direction? So we can look at that from an agility standpoint. We can look at that from a strength standpoint. There's a lot of different ways to use impact control to assess transitions and positions. And I find that to be very practical for the individual that has no background in health or fitness to understand. It's like, yeah, you lost control there because you fell into the chair instead of sat down with control. And that's one of the first things you can cue is just, I don't care what you do, just sit down softly. When you get onto the ground, I don't care how you get on the ground, just don't land hard. One of the best cues you can use to just kind of get people controlling their movements a little bit better. This is the broad overview of the movement continuum. Hopefully that makes sense, that we can go into way more detail about this. And what I'd like to do in next couple of weeks is take things like pain and even dial into the pain continuum that I would look at. And again, just take this idea of continuum-based thinking a little farther. I think we all can be a little extreme in our thinking sometimes, and part of that is when things get defined as individual words or individual entities. Sometimes that's easier to teach it. You have to be able to have language around what you teach. But what gets lost in the teaching process is the fact that a word or a term is not static in nature, but it is always fitting into the spectrum. So I'd like to hopefully give more of these specific examples of how that fits in, and maybe it can help the audience, look at health and fitness at least in less of an extreme manner, and maybe that carries over to some other things in the world. I'll see you next time.